2.5 Admins, episode 252. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, you've got a couple of plugs for us, Alan. An article, Reliable ZFS Storage on Commodity Hardware.
Yeah, so this is just about how you can use normal commodity hardware and disks to have the lowest cost per terabyte possible, which when you're trying to store a lot of data is where the biggest advantage of ZFS comes from. You know, when you're comparing it to commercial solutions that are going to cost huge amounts per terabyte, whereas you can't really beat the price of commodity hardware and, you know, retail this and using ZFS on that, you can't get the price any lower than the cost of the components.
Yeah, buy a £20 Optiplex off eBay, stick some cheap hard drives in it, you're laughing, yeah?
Yeah, not quite, but... But when you look at the fact that, you know, if you go into Dell's configurator on their website and try to add some 20 terabyte drives to a server, they will want to charge you $2,000 for each of those 20 terabyte hard drives that you can buy from any other retailer for $500.
What a deal.
And you've got a link to a webinar that you did with Chris Moore from TrueNAS.
Yeah, so as of recording, we recorded that earlier today, but when you see this, it'll have been out for a couple of days. But yeah, we did a webinar about ZFS Fast Dedupe, some of the use cases for it and when it really makes sense and how to get the most out of it. But yeah, it was great to get back together with Chris. You know, we used to do the BSD Now podcast together 12 years ago. And it turns out we're both still rocking the same Rode microphones and got back together and had another video podcast. It was fun.
Right, well, links in the show notes as usual. Switch 2 users report online console bans after running personal game backups, in quotes.
This is a piece that I saw in Ars Technica, and I found the most interesting part of it, to me at least, in the comments. Now, the main story, of course, is just as it says. There's a device called a MIG flash that you can plug into a Switch, or now Switch 2, that will allow you to directly play backups of your games. And the device is probably mostly used in the wild for piracy, although, you know, the manufacturers of the device say that's not what it's for, that's not, you know, what you should use it for. But what people have been discovering is that even when they have actually dumped their own game that they personally bought, and Nintendo puts certificates in these games, by the way. So like if you dump your game and you let 100 people have a copy of your backup and they all try to play it, Nintendo will catch the fact that that certificate is being used on 100 different Switches simultaneously in the wild, and the lot of you, you know, get bricked for online play, which is all, you know, that's pretty much fair play, right? However, what folks with the Switch 2 are discovering now is that even when they try to play a backup of their own legally purchased game that they haven't shared with anybody else, and therefore there is not, you know, a certificate that's suddenly showing up on 100 different machines out there in the wild, Nintendo is revoking that Switch 2's ability to participate in any online functionality. This all sucks, and of course, you know, the obvious answer is maybe don't try to use that device to play your backups. But that does raise the question then, like, well, isn't that a real problem? Because the DMCA does, in fact, give us the right to back up our games. Now, up until very recently, Nintendo actually had, and this was news to me until this story ran, Nintendo had a section in their intellectual property and piracy Q&A page. I'm just going to read that to you in full right now. Now, this section has disappeared as of today. I'm not sure exactly when it left, but it had been there since December 2022, as you can verify through web.archive.org. And this section, which is now just gone in its entirety, read, "But can I make a backup copy if I own the video game? You may be thinking of the backup archival exception of the U.S. Copyright Act. There's some misinformation on the internet regarding this backup and archival exception. This is a very narrow limitation that extends to computer software. Video games are comprised of numerous types of copyrighted works and should not be categorized as software only. Therefore, provisions that pertain to backup copies would not apply to copyrighted video game works, and specifically ROM downloads that are typically unauthorized and infringing." Now, I would love to see Nintendo get dragged into court and have to argue this idea that they're just trying to shove down everybody's throats, that it's misinformation that you're allowed to back up your own video games.
Yeah, it's got images and stuff, therefore that's not software. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Right, because no other software has any other kind of media, embedded in the software. Nobody's ever written any text for humans to read that isn't program code. Nobody's ever embedded images or video or, any other kind of artwork. I mean, it's ridiculous. And also, let's note the fact that you get to back up all that stuff too. If you buy a painting, nobody's saying you can't take a photograph of your painting.
Yeah, you just can't publish that in a magazine, say.
Exactly. This whole section of Nintendo's Q&A, it's obvious FUD. It is itself misinformation that's accusing people of wanting to exercise their own backup and archival rights as having somehow consumed misinformation. And frankly, it pisses me off. I'm glad it's gone now, but I'm really disappointed that nobody from Nintendo Corporate had to get dragged in front of a court and explain why the hell they put that there. I also frankly wish that there were legal penalties for companies very blatantly engaging in misinformation and disinformation campaigns like that, because you can't tell me that an org with all of the resources and responsibilities of Nintendo does not have legal counsel involved in things like this that can't tell them, guys, I don't know about that one. I don't think that we can back that one up in court. And I don't think that we can even make the case that we thought that we could.
What's alarming to me about this is not the blocking of online play, because you could argue that they sell you the device and it's their servers that you're connecting to, so they kind of have the right to block you from that.
Well, in particular, I think it would be along the lines of you're attaching this unauthorized device that could have modified their software to make it, incompatible with their online service or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's bullshit, but you can see why they get away with it. But before the Switch 2 came out, just shortly before, Nintendo came out and said that they would brick devices, Switch 2s, that were playing pirated games. Now, they've not done that yet, but this kind of feels quite ominous to me.
I think you're missing the fact that arguably it's already bricked once the device gets banned from online. And I don't just mean because you can't play online and so many people very specifically want to play online. I mean that it's not just online play that you can't do anymore. You can't touch the Nintendo Cloud with that device at all, which means you can't get firmware updates, which means that soon enough, even games that you buy, and by the way, how are you buying your games? Because everybody I know with a Switch is buying them from the Nintendo store online.
You can go into Best Buy and buy a cart, though, and stick it in theory.
Okay, but how long is it before that cart depends on a firmware update that you haven't been able to get because Nintendo just absolutely said you can never touch our services ever again because you tried to play an archived copy of your own game once?
I suppose you're right. So there's not really much of a line there between bricking it full stop and not allowing it to connect to their servers. Yeah.
We have to acknowledge that the era of like a game is a thing and a console is a thing and you bought the console and you buy games for the consoles. And either way, like once you have it, it's a thing and it never has to get, updated again. That hasn't been the case for a very long time, and it's not just firmware updates for the console. The games themselves get updates and patches as well. And riddle me this. If a third-party developer drops new functionality and new content for a game, and you are no longer allowed to access it because the only way to get to it is going through Nintendo's cloud, we're talking about abridging a lot of people's stuff in order for Nintendo to be super authoritarian, about this policy that already, again, is very squarely saying not just, well, hey, we don't know if this is legit or not, and, so we're trying to protect ourselves, but they were very firmly telling people you aren't allowed to back up your own games.
Yeah, I suppose the lesson here is buy a Steam Deck, not a Switch, because Valve don't really care what you do with that. You can run old emulators if you want. You can buy Steam games. They'd obviously prefer that, but ultimately it's just a PC, is what they say, and I kind of believe them.
I mean, essentially it is a PC. You can install generic, Linux applications on it. I don't know how much more of a definition of standard PC we need.
Echo Leak, the first zero-click AI vulnerability enabling data exfiltration from Microsoft 365 Copilot.
Yeah, this one's interesting in that it basically chains together a couple of different exploits they found to get a zero-click exploit. So instead of the user having to do something, they can actually just send you an email, and the act of reading that email will cause the data exfiltration to happen. Basically, when the AI reads the email, it, via these exploits, does more than it's supposed to. One of them is the link redaction bypass. So the Copilot is only supposed to access organizational resources that are accessible to employees, and it's supposed to not include links to outside. The problem with this approach is that Copilot redacts any external links from the chat history before the user has any chance to click on those links. And because of the way the Copilot works, it uses Markdown. So it turns out if you feed a regular Markdown link in, it will realize that that's a link and redact it so that you can't easily just accidentally click on the external evil thing. However, if you do the footnotes reference style link, where instead of putting the link inline in the text, you give it a name, and then later in the footnotes, you define that name and a URL, the Microsoft code doesn't know about that type of Markdown link and doesn't redact it. And so you end up with a link that maybe could have extra secrets or whatever in the URL and mean that if you clicked on it, it would do the bad thing. But they're like, well, that still requires the user to click on something though. So then they found if we do the Markdown image embedding, so a regular Markdown link, but you put an exclamation mark at the beginning of it, then it will actually load an image. And so you can allow it to load an image from some external website. And as part of that, pass whatever information you want back out as part of the URL.
I know I keep saying this, but I'm just going to have to point out again, this looks to me, it's social engineering. You allowed a semi-autonomous thing to answer emails, and remote users that are smarter than your semi-autonomous thing can trick it into doing things that they want it to do that it should not do. And this is going to remain a very difficult type of vulnerability to close because you're having the dumbest person in your organization answer the phone to anybody who calls, and that dumbest person in your org who's answering the phone has access to every single bit of data in the org. It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, Microsoft's working on adding new features to the Microsoft 365 roadmap that will allow you to restrict Copilot from processing emails that have a sensitivity label or came from external sources. But note that activating these features degrades the capabilities of Copilot as it can no longer process these external or sensitive documents to be able to answer questions about them. So it's kind of, you just have to opt everything out, and then what's the point of the AI?
Just last time we recorded, we talked about something fairly similar with SharePoint. And I said, this is not the last we're going to see of this. And sure enough, here we are 2 weeks later recording. And yeah, it's a slightly different vector, but it's ultimately comes down to the same thing, doesn't it?
It's pretty much the same thing. The big difference is instead of someone being able to be in there and ask questions of your AI, they're just sending you an email, and your AI, in reading it and processing it, is sending them back information even without replying to the email by just loading the images and so on that are embedded in the email.
I think there's an argument to be made that, well, for one thing, we're not going to be able to get away from this anytime soon, not only because of the complexity involved, but also just because the speed at which these massive organizations like Microsoft are forcibly cramming models into everything they possibly can. It's downright criminal. It's irresponsible. It is absolutely nuts. This is not even about AI specifically. If somebody tried to cram any new feature, anything close to that complexity, by default into every single client's, a data set and, set of applications on this kind of scale, any competent engineer would be like, whoa, hold on. This stuff isn't tested. We don't know what the ramifications are going to be. Like, this needs more time to cook. But none of the big orgs are making these kind of slow down calls. They're just, more and more trying to cram AI into everything as rapidly as they possibly can. It's not just Microsoft. Microsoft's doing it. Google's doing it. I mean, to a degree, even Apple is doing it. It's across the board.
Yeah, I think part of it is also the change in the ecosystem. It's not like the olden days where you would buy, Microsoft Office 2023 and then keep using it for a couple of years and then update. Or even, where there were just software updates for the version you had on your PC. Now with Microsoft 365, it's just this one continuous version that, might silently update every single day with new features. And there's not really these kind of milestone versions where a new feature gets introduced and maybe you opt into it at some point. It is very much, they just keep adding this shit and forcing it on people who maybe haven't actually configured it. Even some other services I use are like, oh, starting in at the end of July, we're enabling a bunch of AI features on your shit. Click here in the next 30 days and turn it off if you don't want it.
I'm not going to blame this on CI/CD pipelines. I'm just not. Do I have some issues with CI/CD pipelines and very rapid release and, the erosion of quality guarantees? Sure. But let's be realistic here. Microsoft has been doing, these kinds of trialed introduction of features out into the wild for a very long time now. And there has always been, there's a procedure for this. You have like 3 different versions of anything that's in development. You've got essentially, and I'm just going to start mixing terms here, I know, because Google has their own and Microsoft has their own. But basically, you've got an alpha and you've got a beta and you've got a release candidate is when it comes down to. Google calls their alphas canaries. I forget what Microsoft's terminology is, but it always boils down to, you've got an alpha, a beta, a release candidate, and then it goes out into the wild. And you look at like Microsoft's Insider program, when they're developing new features and new functionality, it goes first to the folks who have been like, yeah, I signed on to the Windows Insider program and I put myself on Edge. That's what they call their stuff. I put myself on the Edge releases to get the newest possible stuff because I want to see it first. I want to play with it. So you get those people to do the first dog fooding. Until you've had them on it for a while, you don't move it down past that, to the next stage and the next. And then finally it goes out to the public. By the time it's gone out to the whole public, you've had several stages of relatively small populations of external users that have trialed that feature. That's not what we're seeing with this AI crap. We're just all getting nailed with it, whether we like it or not. And again, it's not just Microsoft. Like 2 nights ago, I discovered that Google had automatically replaced my Google Assistant with its stupid Gemini model. You want to know how I discovered that? I discovered it when I was having a conversation with my wife, and all of a sudden my phone piped up to tell me what an interesting turn of phrase I'd used and start yammering on about the etymology of the phrase that I used. And I was, what the hell? And I reach over and grab my phone off of the end table, and I see that, it's announcing that, oh, hey, it's Gemini now. And if I don't like it, well, I can switch back to boring old Google Assistant if I want, like a loser, but...
Yeah, but I think kind of building on what you were saying before the Gemini part, that kind of progression through those different versions usually also meant the enterprise version got all of that even later. There was an even bigger delay between, when it rolled out for most people and when it rolled out for the big enterprise customers. But this AI stuff seems to be going to the enterprisey people first. And it's leading to all these problems where like the people who have the biggest, most sensitive data are getting this AI in there and exfiltrating it out to whoever asks.
I don't think it's technically going to the enterprisey people first. I think the enterprisey people are just more likely to be on Microsoft's cloud to a greater degree. And basically, Microsoft is jamming this stuff into everybody's pocket as fast as they possibly can. They're not really discriminating. That's again kind of the point. You're not having this, tiered deployment where you do like a little bit at a time and see how it goes and make sure everything's okay before you potentially wreck the entire ecosystem with it. And we're doing the exact opposite of that now. We are cramming new technology, untested, not even really properly modeled, into everything as rapidly as possible.
Yeah, in particular, because of the way AI works, they want to get the most data, the most training on stuff before everybody else. And so everybody's throwing their stuff out there and trying to make it listen to everything you say and kind of get the most information first and have the bot that can answer the questions the best based on having the most context. And nobody stopped to ask if, I wanted it to do that.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. Patreon supporters have the option to listen to episodes without ads like this. And it's not just this show. There's Late Night Linux for news, discoveries, audience input, and misanthropy. Linux Matters for upbeat family-friendly adventures. Linux After Dark for silly challenges and philosophical debates. Linux Dev Time about developing with and for Linux. Hybrid Cloud Show for everything public and private cloud. And Ask the Hosts for off-topic questions from you. You can even get some episodes a bit early. We've got a lot going on, and it's only possible because of the people who support us. So if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us too at 2.5admins.com/support. I learned the hard way never to spin down your NAS hard drives.
This was a blog post on xdadevelopers.com, which is not normally someplace I go for NAS advice. And honestly, it's not the easiest blog post to read, in part because of the decision to absolutely litter it with random images of hard drives, almost none of which are NAS grade. We've got pictures of Western Digital blues. We've got pictures of purples. There's a Barracuda thrown in there. However, the author does, buried 2/3 of the way through the article, say that he was using 4 NAS grade drives. So that's good. Whatever those drives were, we'll assume that's the case. The issue that the author encountered was by setting their NAS to spin down the drives when not in use, they were spinning up and down as much as 20 times a day. And, well, that's really, really hard on a drive, even a NAS grade drive, and they died a lot earlier than they really should have. So the short version of this here is essentially it's a demonstration of something I've been advising people for a very long time, which is do not try to spin down drives in a NAS. It's not worth it. You can save a very, very small amount of power in return for putting a whole lot more wear and tear on your drives, and it's just not a good idea. Even if your entire focus is environmental, I promise you, you're not going to save enough power by spinning down your drives 20 times a day to justify the cost of buying drives twice as frequently because you keep burning them out. There's an environmental cost in manufacturing those drives in the first place, and if you can't get their entire rated use out of them, you're doing damage to the environment just as much as you are if you're using more power than you might otherwise be using.
Yeah, there's just a physical limit to the number of times you can start and stop the drive. And if you're doing it thousands and thousands of times unnecessarily, the drive is not going to last nearly as long.
For those of you who don't have any electrical or mechanical engineering in your background, we can give you a quick explanation of why spinning drives down and up is so hard on them. The primary answer is something called startup current. When you first start up an electric motor, you wind up needing to draw frequently 20 to even 100 times as much current in just those first few milliseconds is what you normally have to burn in steady state operation of the drive. And that happens every single time you've got to bring the drive up from stop. So if you're spinning the drive all the way down, now I'm not saying that you're using as much power as you would be leaving the drives rotating all the time. You're not. It only takes a few seconds of the drives running to equal those first few milliseconds when you've got, the full startup current running through the coil. However, as you can probably imagine, that extra, 20 to 100 times as much current as you're bringing through those coils, that means a lot of wear and tear. It means wear and tear on those coils themselves. It means wear and tear on the voltage regulation circuitry in the motor. It means additional wear and tear even on the bearings as you're rapidly spinning the drive up basically as quickly as you can from zero. Because what none of these spin up and spin down features I've ever seen actually do is gradually bring the drive up. If you were willing potentially to wait 5 seconds for a drive to become available once it had been spun down, as the motor very slowly brought it from 0 RPM, up to 7,200, that might be a different story. However, that would also mean you would have significant latency in accessing the files that most people would not enjoy. And again, it's just not what we're actually doing here. It's not even an option.
Yeah, and to kind of put that in perspective, going from 0 to 7,200 RPM, at the outer edge of the disk, the linear velocity at 7,200 RPM is something like 100 kilometers an hour or 60 miles an hour. So it's literally going 0 to 60 really fast and then back down to 0 again. So imagine your car if you're just every 5 seconds going to 60 and then back to 0 and then to 60 and back to 0. Your brakes are going to wear out awfully damn quick.
If we must do the car analogy, this is essentially like doing a full-on red line clutch dump at every single red light. Stuff's going to break.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Riot says, I self-host Nextcloud on my home lab. I don't expose any services to the public internet, and I access my services remotely using Tailscale. I put a lot of important personal data on my Nextcloud instance, therefore I'm very anxious about it being compromised, and I'm not satisfied with the existing built-in Nextcloud encryption solutions since they cannot encrypt all data generated by Nextcloud, for example databases. I'm looking for a security system like SE Linux, but easier to use and set up, to secure my files from threat actors in the event that my home lab is compromised.
Well, you're already doing things right by limiting access to this to somebody who has access to your Tailscale network. That is already head and shoulders above anything else that you could do to help secure this system, is simply not have it publicly accessible in the first place. With that said, you're right. If somebody manages to get it toehold in your network somehow, and the most likely way would be, via your own actions using a browser touching the internet, they might then be able to get at your Nextcloud and, get places that you don't want them to from there. And if you're looking for a way then to secure your Nextcloud data so that you have to actually successfully log into Nextcloud in order to be able to get at that data and not bypass that by simply shelling into the system and getting all the data, in some other way, I think probably what you're going to be looking for is a tool like FireJail. FireJail is a community project that it offers a lot of the same sort of features that you'd see from either SE Linux or AppArmor, depending on which distribution, along with a few more. Basically, it's an easy way to run applications inside a sandbox and not allow things to escape that sandbox and then go wreak havoc on the rest of the system. I think that's probably the majority of what you're really going to be looking for here. And the interesting thing to me is that I think for your actual stated purposes, that you're worried about somebody getting at your Nextcloud data, not so much through a vulnerability in Nextcloud it yourself, but just as a result of getting into your home lab from somewhere, anywhere. It's not really Nextcloud that you're looking to secure using FireJail. What you probably want to do is you want to sandbox anything that does touch the internet. And that's not only going to mean server-side stuff, and I would argue again, doesn't even primarily mean server-side stuff, like other things that you're running as services on your home lab. Your own browser is the biggest source of danger on your network, almost certainly. So wrapping your browser in an additional sandbox, something along the lines of FireJail, can go a long way towards preventing an attacker that gets in via some drive-by exploit on your browser. Some of those require a user click, some of the 0 days, it's literally just you watch the wrong ad and, boom, you've got nasty JavaScript running on your system. And if you've got a sandbox wrapped around the browser, well, then that keeps it from going and doing more damage elsewhere. Now, to be fair, modern browsers, I think all of the major ones at this point have their own sandbox built in. But the downside to the built-in sandbox in a browser already is every single attacker who wants to nail you when you're using that browser already knows perfectly well they've got to escape that sandbox. What they don't know about is any additional sandbox layer you've got outside of that. And again, I think FireJail is going to be the most easily accessible tool for the purpose.
Yeah, so the problem with things like SE Linux in this case is that you need Nextcloud to be able to do things to these files as the software that's running Nextcloud. And if somebody compromises Nextcloud or is able to log in as a user using Nextcloud, they're going to be indistinguishable from a legitimate user in Nextcloud. And so either Nextcloud's allowed to touch that file or it's not. There's not a great way to say, detect that it's a malicious person using Nextcloud.
That's why encryption isn't necessarily that useful here, right?
Well, yeah, and like almost any encryption, right? Like if you're using any kind of full disk encryption like LUKS or even ZFS dataset encryption, if the dataset's mounted so that you can read it, it's also mounted so someone else can read it.
Yeah.
And so regular encryption only protects your data when it's at rest, which means not mounted and inaccessible. And so it's really about protecting the data in your home lab from someone physically stealing it. And that's usually not the threat most home labs are actually worried about.
So again, just to wrap up, the thing that we really are recommending that you expend your energy on protecting here is not your Nextcloud itself, because you've already isolated that from the internet. So that's not where the bad guys are going to come in. We're recommending that you secure everything that does touch the internet, which means your own browsers, local email clients, any other services you run on your home lab that you might actually be exposing directly to the public internet. Those are the things that you really need to be working on securing.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at joelrest.com/mastodon.
You can find me at mercenarysysadmin.com.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.